Let's reflect on all of this in the company of three seasoned commentators: Ian McWhirter, Lorraine Davidson and David Torrance. Look, we've talked about Scottish stuff in a moment. Lorraine, I'm just curious what you make of the overall picture in the UK. I mean, is this the coming of Ed Miliband?
I don't know that you can say that at this stage. I think you have to remember, I was in London when it was the last set of English local council results, and it was an absolute car crash for the Labour Party. So Ed Miliband is certainly helped by the fact that the last time a lot of people in England went to the polls to vote for their local councillor, it was actually at the height of Gordon Brown's troubles. So he was always going to have a good night. But certainly I think it's been beyond Labour's expectations, certainly in the rest of the country and in Scotland as well.
David Maddox, it's a curious question what's going to happen next, isn't it? There must be immense pressures within the coalition now. We've seen right-wing Tory MPs parading themselves to say Cameron's got to stop sucking up to Liberal Democrats. We've got Liberal Democrats parading themselves saying enough of this, we're losing out, we've got to stop sucking up to the Conservatives. How does that pan out, do you think?
There are definitely tensions there, and also actually, although we don't know the result yet, the fact that Boris Johnson might just scrape the mayoral race in London is a bit of a blow. I mean, the Tories see Boris Johnson as being a Conservative apart, if you like, someone who bucks the trend of the Tories' general popularity. And for Ken Livingstone to run him close is quite something. Within the coalition, there are bound
Although
to
if Boris does win, I mean, that is, in a bad night, that's good news for every member of the Conservative Party, with the possible exception of David Cameron.
Well, indeed, and there's constant speculation about Boris Johnson's true ambition. But within the coalition, there's bound to be tension over that. The Liberal Democrats continue to lose out from this partnership, and indeed the Conservatives are doing badly as well. Nick Clegg attempts to explain this away, saying that over time voters will come round and realise that the Lib Dems
Willie
made the right
Rennie's just been telling us
yes. Willie Rennie's self-flagellation over this is quite brutal. That over time voters will realise the coalition have been making the right decisions. It's subject to the law of diminishing returns, I think.
Ian McWhirter, I mean, because we tend to talk of these things on programmes like this as if it's just statistics, but of course, from the Liberal Democrats' point of view, I mean, they've got lots of people who were councillors who are now no longer in the jobs they were in. They must have lots of members of Parliament sitting thinking, my gosh, I'm out of a job come the next election. I mean, how long can they go on just doing this and taking these hits?
Well, yeah, absolutely, not least in Scotland. I mean, there's a limit to the amount of punishment that any political party can take, and I think the Liberal Democrats must be reaching the pain threshold now, and I think there will now be moves to further disengage the Liberal Democrats from the UK coalition. They've been doing that to a certain extent. They did it over the budget, if you remember. They carefully positioned themselves so it was quite clear that the tax cuts for the rich were the Tory part of the budget, while they claimed ownership of the reduction in the increase in the threshold for personal allowances. So they have been breaking apart and asserting their own identity to a certain extent. Now, it's clearly not doing them any good, at least not in these results, but I think we'll see a lot more of that.
Will that work for them, though, David Torrance? Sorry, I called you something else earlier on. Will that work? Will that work for them?
It could. I mean, the lesson from the coalition experience between the Lib Dems and Labour in Scotland for 2 terms was actually a very positive one. The Liberal Democrats maintained a bit of distance. Crucially, they were seen to get something out of the arrangement. That is where the Lib Dems have failed.
And they were also
seen
not to be giving up on key things.
Absolutely. In fact, they won a key concession, single transferable vote for local government.
What do you make, Lorraine Davis? I mean, we still don't know this result. I mean, clearly this, the Ken and Boris show, which was expected to be a sort of walkover for Boris, as late as this morning, and it clearly, even though he might win, we don't know, it's much closer, isn't it?
Obviously, and to take that right to the wire and recounts, I think that helps Ed Miliband quite a lot as well, because London should be Labour territory, and I think it would have helped the Conservatives enormously in terms of holding back the Ed Miliband momentum feeling to be able to say, but look, in London, in the capital, which should be Labour territory, you cannot get that back. So to have even run that close, I think does take some of the shine off and will help the perception thing. It's like the SNP thing in Glasgow. The SNP have had a good night, but because of the symbolism of Glasgow and the headline that is, in the same way that the Boris Ken show is the headline in the UK story, that's the perception and the illusion that the voters are left with.
All right, Luke, don't go away because we'll be back with you in a moment. Well, a panel of experts are still here. They've been sitting around wishing that they got past most of 40%, haven't you? Despite the turnout, there is some ambiguity. It's a very peculiar election, this, that both Labour and the SNP seem to have legitimate claims to have done best. So I'm interested in, David, what's your take on that?
I think the SNP have clearly won this election. I mean, winning elections is measured by the total number of seats and share of the vote, and they appear to have won both, so they have certainly won it. I think it was more of a psychological victory for the Labour Party because they simply didn't expect to do this well, and indeed the SNP expected to do quite a bit better. Winning Glasgow for Labour against all of the odds, up against significantly greater resources from the SNP, was a major result for them.
What do you make of it?
I think the SNP have won the election, but they've lost the expectations game. The problem that they had was that with Glasgow, which was going to be a stunning prize for them and an important part of the journey towards the referendum, they had to, first of all, put themselves in contention as serious players to win that election. Hence the spring conference and the predictions that they were going to take Glasgow a couple of months ago. The problem with that is when you create that kind of expectation around an election, you're then left trying to explain away why they didn't pull that off. The reason they didn't pull that off was it was totally unrealistic. They were never going to be able to pull that off. But if I was an SNP strategist, I think tonight you would be looking at, you would be slightly worried about the picture in Glasgow, about the picture in Edinburgh and Aberdeen, in those cities, with a view to the referendum, why your message wasn't carrying.
Let's come on to the referendum in a moment. Ian, I'm just interested in your take on this and whether perhaps someone suggested an article, I'm not sure if it was one of you recently, that perhaps the SNP didn't serve their own interests very well by making such a big thing of their wish to win Glasgow, because then everyone would say they failed to win it. Whereas if they hadn't said that, we might all be sitting around saying, well, this is an amazing result for the SNP.
Well, following the landslide victory at the Scottish elections last year, anything was possible. I mean, they swept all before them. They won a lot of seats in Glasgow, so it was realistic for them to think that Glasgow could be in their sights. At least they could break Labour's grip on the city. Clearly, they allowed their expectations to run away with them. But I don't think it was unrealistic for them to make that attempt. And as David says, this is not a bad result for the SNP. But the core question about momentum is raised as a result of this, because clearly this is a psychological setback, a presentational difficulty, if you like. But now they have to regenerate the kind of enthusiasm that was buoying the party on after May 2011, and which has fallen back. The truth is that both Labour and the SNP won this election. They both made advances, largely by picking over the carcass of the Liberal Democrats, particularly in areas like Edinburgh. But they both had a kind of success here, and it's very difficult to tear it apart. But the difference is, it's a differential success from last time. Last time it was a landslide, this time they're sharing the spoils with Labour, and that's the difficulty for them.
And what implications do you think that has for the independence referendum, or indeed the campaign ahead of it, which looks like going on from about a week from now for 2 years?
One view, obviously favourable to the SNP, is that the kind of SNP vote you're seeing now is more of an independence vote. In May 2011, people were voting because they were fed up with Labour and they wanted a better government in Holyrood. Now they've spent a year thinking about independence. Independence is very much on the agenda. We know there's going to be a referendum. And since the Unionist offensive launched by David Cameron in February, we've been talking about very little else apart from independence. So the SNP will be saying, well, people are voting much more positively now for an independence party when they vote for the SNP. Of course, Labour say that's complete nonsense. In fact, people are just waking up to the reality that the SNP is a one-trick party that is only interested in the Constitution, and they, particularly in areas like Glasgow, want to be protected from the social policies of the Conservative-led coalition in London.
Ian's very, very carefully sat on the fence there, David. What do you make of that? What implications do you think it has for the referendum?
I think you can read too much into these sorts of results, but the major effect, I think, is psychological. There was a danger that Labour was going to become a lost cause, particularly in light of last year's election. For activists, for morale of activists and the campaigning machine, that's terrifically important. They've now had a boost, and Labour managed this result in Glasgow and elsewhere with minimal resources, with, as one Labour person described to me, a party machine that was broken. They managed that with few resources up against a formidable, well-oiled SNP machine. Just imagine what Labour can do with more money, when they have a greater confidence in what they're doing and a better developed message. So I think it's a slight, modest halt on the SNP advance, but no more than that at the moment. But it gives Labour something to build on.
But it is looking like a long way now until the referendum. We're talking October 2014. What is going to fill the gap between now and then? What is going to generate the SNP momentum and keep it going until that referendum? That's
interesting. Your ideas, your views on this issue of momentum, wasn't it? Because one of the things from the result last year was that, although it, of course, a lot of people would have voted SNP who didn't necessarily agree with independence. It created this sort of momentum. It was like, you know, nothing was going to set this juggernaut back. It was inevitable that it was all going to end up in Scotland voting. And a lot of people might think now, well, maybe not.
It was a clever trick of Salmon's at the time of the Scottish election to say, I'm having it in the second half, to push it away. But I'm not sure he's not going to come to regret that, because Alex Salmond has had an extraordinarily long political honeymoon by the standards of any politician in any country in the world. He's going to have to keep that honeymoon going for another 2.5 years. And I think they've got a specific problem in Glasgow. I've spent a lot of time speaking to people in Glasgow this week, and voters were saying things like you would only expect Labour politicians to say about Alex Salmond, about his style of leadership, about the referendum, about independence. And, you know, some of those doubts are going to build and build, and I'm not sure that his party aren't going to think, hang on a minute, you know, playing the long game maybe wasn't so clever.
So perhaps don't launch your independence referendum campaign in a couple of weeks. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I think there are problems with him trying to wait 2.5 years when the shine appears to be coming off, and we've had the whole Murdoch and Trump thing. His political honeymoon could be coming to an end, but there's also massive health warnings about taking anything out of local government elections and transporting them.
Okay, now thank you all very much.